And the first painting we're going to look at is a portrait. It's a posthumous portrait of Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz. It's painted by Miguel Cabrera. Miguel Cabrera at the time he still is considered one of the best painters of the region. He painted castas, and his casta paintings are visually stunning. Has anyone heard of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz before?
A little bit, I think. I could be wrong. She, maybe I'm mixing up St. Teresa with what I read about her. She the one that her parents sent her off to be a nun, and she was still wild and had lots of visitors. I'm maybe mixing up my
She actually.
Visitation rights. St. Teresa, I think, is what I'm mixing up here.
So she wasn't sent. She actually chose to become a nun. In her case, she actually chose to become a nun. But she did have a lot of visitors. She was considered a child prodigy back in her day. And she would, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it kind of parallels the story of Jesus as a child, where he would just debate with elders about, in her case, about the sciences. So she was considered a prodigy. She talked about physics and math. She's Mexico's possibly most famous writer. Today we would consider her a feminist. At the time, this idea of feminism doesn't exist, right? So proto-feminist, I guess, is how we would discuss her. So she's known as both a nun and a writer, but she's a famous writer and poet. She was from the Order of Saint Jerome. She's a noble woman, right? And this goes back to Europe. Many noble women could become nuns, and you would lead a fairly good life if you were a noble nun. She just wanted to continue studying and writing, and so she chooses to become a nun. So she wanted to be an intellectual, right? And at that time, a female could not be an intellectual. You couldn't. You had to get married and be a good wife. And in her case, she decides to become a nun in order to continue pursuing her intellectual interests.
Which fields does she write about?
She's really famous for her poetry. And her poetry has been associated with almost romance. And so there's a lot of kind of veiled readings within it. There's a lot of gossip about maybe who she might have been with. But
not science, not botany, not...
she's interested in everything. But her poetry is very famous.
But we would find writings on biology or medicine or...
Becky, theology, I was going to say theology mostly, Becky.
A vision of the universe, a way of thinking?
Probably, yes. She wrote poetry plays, and she was constantly involved in theological debates with other religious intellectuals.
I don't think Hildegard von Bingen is any longer in our 250s, is that right? There's some definite comparisons there. She's older.
Did she have miracles or visions or anything like that, supernatural, or was it all?
That's not what she's ever focused on. She's always spoken about, not that I know of. I'm just going to say not that I know of. She's always spoken about her intellect. We see Miguel Cabrera painting her as an intellectual, right? She's wearing her garb, she's wearing her nun garb, but she's very much presented as an intellectual. We could just pull her out and put a male figure in it, and the background would be the same. She's in a library, right? So she's sitting by her desk We know she's either reading or writing. So there's a book, there's quills by her. And she's surrounded by textbooks, completely surrounded by textbooks.
Are those, I'm wondering about the kind of circular symbol under her neck. And then
That's what you're looking at.
Yeah.
So that's not the same exact one, but it's a similar one.
And also the beads, those are rosary.
These are rosary beads, and this is a nun's badge that nuns would have worn. Hers is an apparition. I just couldn't find an apparition badge to show you, so I'm just showing you something similar.
What is an apparition badge?
The badge showing a scene of the apparition, sorry. Did I just say the apparition? The Annunciation.
Oh, thank you.
I was just like, why am I not making any sense? Because I'm not making any sense. The Annunciation is what I meant. Sorry.
Is that a typical scene for a nun's badge?
That's huge.
I'm not sure they're really that big. I've been trying to find scale on them. I'm not really sure they're that big. I think it's painted that big for the painting, for you to see it. Yeah. Have you ever seen one in person, Becky?
No, I just was in a museum in Mexico City late last year, and I saw many that were like sort of like this.
So a little bit bigger than a compact mirror.
But there were many.
Would
that
they be
were
worn
just
like all the
I mean,
time?
that
Or
makes sense.
just something they would have?
Yeah, no, this is for.
But it's not as big as the one.
Wealth, for one, right?
Yes, so if you were a wealthy nun, yes. Yes, if you were a wealthy nun, you would have nicer beads, a nicer badge. You're married to the church, so these are your.
You know, I don't know. I mean, I know about rosary beads, and I often see them as much shorter. And I thought there were so many beads, and then a bead, and then so many beads and a bead, but in threes. When you see them this long, does that mean she's so much more religious because she's doing all of those rosary prayers?
I'm looking at you, Becky, and I'm sorry I'm looking at you because I've seen I've seen the really long ones used in Mexican weddings. You've probably seen some of those because you tie the bride and the groom with those. I don't know why these are that long. The beads are larger if you look at them, at least in the painting, they're really large. So I think the count is actually accurate. It's just the size of the bead is bigger. So you usually wear it around your neck, right?
So they're used in a wedding ceremony, would that maybe be since she's married to Christ?
Maybe. And I mean, rosaries are used for so many things. But yes, there's a specific count of beads, which I should probably know.
Your grandma's saying.
I used to have to, you pray these. In October, you pray it every night, and whenever somebody dies, you pray it for, I don't remember how many days. I can sing the rosary songs to you. I did memorize those because when you sing them, they're so much easier. But the beads are I think the bead count is accurate. It's just we're seeing really large beads. But usually we associate beads with just carrying them around your neck. Sometimes you have a small, a bracelet one.
Isn't there 10 between each of the big ones, though?
It's so many prayers in between each of the big ones.
And then the big one is
It's different kinds of prayer. I mean, it's the same rosary, but each one is different. You know, just an AP connection, there's an AP music theory teacher who wrote music for the rosary and created it for his church, and then they sold them.
Wow.
And they're beautiful.
Can you speak to the delicacy of her hands? Is that?
those are really beautiful.
That's what I noticed is the delicacy of her hands.
They're very feminine, noble,
Yeah.
very noble hands. So I would agree and just kind of say that yes, it just kind of shows that she's, somebody from a high-ranking position. She comes from a background of wealth.
She's not laboring with those.
No, she's not.
Doing yard work, yeah.
We're not looking at Dutch genre paintings where you see the big-handed workers. No, here we're seeing these really beautiful. This is a clock, and then the medallion thing above her is usually It's text, and it tells you usually the name of the artist and who he's painted, and usually it'll have a bit of a bio blurb. And that's something that is really common in colonial portraiture in the Americas. And if you think of Frida Kahlo paintings, she'll a lot of times incorporate text, and it'll be making reference to this style that becomes so popular in the Americas. And the text, in this case, he's created it as a decorative medallion on top. Some artists will do that. Sometimes it'll be on the bottom. And the text, if you want to know more about it in general, the text, it depends on the artist, but it usually tells you a little bit about who that person was, the name of the artist, the name of the person, who the person was, and maybe when the piece was painted, and if they passed away, like if it's a posthumous portrait, which are pretty popular, it'll tell you when they died, and it might even tell you how they died.
Do we know what this one says, or we're just saying that's
I can't see it close enough, but I think I see his name.
Okay. And
Actually, I don't know what it's, I need a close-up of it.
Okay, so we'll get one. Is that a red drapery that's being pulled across?
It's a curtain. It's a red curtain.
Kind of pulled back.
Mhm.
It's a little Baroque. What?
It reminds me of, let me see if I can remember, Peele's painting where he's moving, where he's moving the curtain and you're looking into his museum.
Right.
So these are common tropes.
Yeah, they are.
So they're common tropes from the time, right? Was it Peele that, or?
They also dramatize the moment.
Yes.
And the light does too.
Also, it's a red, thick velvet, again, rich.
Well, and also it
Wealth.
accentuates the privacy of her space.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was she Creole or Spanish or any idea about that?
I think she would have been Creole. She would have been white, but she would have been born in the Americas.
And you don't know the years that she lived, do we know that?
Yes. 1648 through 1695.
Okay, and why was this image created? What would have been the purpose for creating it?
Especially so much 50 years later.
She's one of the most famous literary figures in Mexico at the time.
And so would
She's
this
very-
have been commissioned for the church? Or?
I don't know if this piece is commissioned. Let me see if I have a note. I don't think it is a commissioned piece. A family could have commissioned it. The nunnery could have commissioned it.
Okay, but we're unsure of where
I'm
this
not sure
was
about
originally
whether.
placed.
Mhm.
Okay.
And sometimes we don't know. Like we just don't know. So it's not like me just saying I don't know, but it's just we really don't know.
You know, with our new curriculum, we're focusing on form, function, content, context. You know, the red, the drapery and the table, I mean, that's a compositional element too.
Mhm.
The red's being used to create diagonals.
Very nice balance.
So,
There's a balance being created there. Even in her, I guess, attributes, there's a balance between her religious life, right? We're seeing her beads very prominently, and then her books being displayed all around her. So we're seeing her religious life, right, which is her, I guess, her spiritual path, and her intellectual status. And the quills, again, they remind us that she's a woman who can read and write. Right, this is quite important.
She would be writing in Spanish?
Spanish and Latin. I think she spoke several languages, if I remember correctly, but Latin and Spanish would have been the primary languages. Because at that time, I mean, Latin's a language that was used by the church until the 70s.
Would there be any effort by the Spaniards to learn indigenous languages, or they were more interested in them learning?
I think so they were definitely documenting indigenous languages, and some priests were studying them. But when you think about colonialism, it's not usually about you learning about the people, but about imposing your ways on them. Sadly, because a lot gets lost, right when you're wiping everything out. You're trying to come up with that clean.
So historically speaking, why do you think this piece is such a significant piece of all the portraits that we can talk about?
It's painted by one of the most famous portrait artists of the era. So it's a Miguel Cabrera painting. And
Represents this connection to the
nun portraiture in Mexico is extremely important and prominent. And if you're interested in that specifically, I'm just trying to think of the specific author. There are a couple of art historians who have written about this, and there's all sorts of nun portraiture. So you would get a portrait made of you when you joined the convent, and it was almost like your marriage portrait. And you would also get a death portrait. And the monjas coronadas are pretty popular in Mexico, and I think you can actually still see the corpses, right, Becky? In some churches, they'll actually have the corpses of the nuns. And I'm just asking Becky because, sorry, I'm totally throwing you into this, but the portrait, so nun portraiture is really actually important and prominent in present day Mexico.
Well, I've heard of the idea that families would want one of their sons to go into the priesthood. Would families hope one of their daughters, so maybe this is even a way to inspire the daughters to aspire to be a nun?
Yeah, so I mean, you're exactly right. So families, well-to-do Spanish families, right, Creole families, would want to place, if possible, a son in the church and a daughter in the church, or more, right?
Yeah.
And then marry a son as well.
Yeah.
It's partly a strategy to preserve family wealth, so you don't have as many children inheriting, because the ones who go to the church won't inherit. But these are very prominent people, and so they go into the church with wealth and with vestments that are...
Does it impact your salvation?
Oh, definitely, yes.
So you want somebody seeing to the spiritual needs of the family, but also...
So that's their job, is to bring everybody along with them.
Sure, and to, pray for them and all sorts of things. But convents were also sort of the banks of the colonial period, right? So when you went into the nunnery, just like with the marriage, you brought a dowry.
Mm-hmm.
That dowry was then loaned out to local people for various things, and so a well-placed daughter helped bring credit to families, to well-placed families.
Also, remember the church is an important political, it's a very important player within politics. So you also strategically want to have people in there watching out for you. So yes, it's about salvation. So there's all these other things, right? Salvation.
She kind of represents all of that.
Yeah, but she's a really interesting figure in that she wanted, right? That, or at least that's the way she's always written about. She wanted to be a nun because she wanted to lead an intellectual life that as a married woman, she wouldn't have been able to lead, and she would have been married to someone wealthy. She just would have had to have been a wife and would have had to entertain and have children. And as a nun, all she had to do, or all she could do, wanted to do, was read and write, and that's what she dedicated her life to.
Well, I think that maybe even speaks to, why this figure. I think anytime contemporary historians can find a proto-feminist, they just want that in the pile.
Yeah. But she's just such a prominent figure in Mexican history and culture.
I'm wondering if this whole idea that being part of the clergy or a nun brought the family esteem, is that distinct from Europe? Because I understood that in Europe...
Prestige.
Yeah, or prestige, sorry.
Yeah, prestige.
Is that distinct from Europe? I understood that clergymen in Europe, that wasn't necessarily a prestige.
The clergy is stratified as well. I mean, when you think about, there are hierarchies within the church. So the higher ranking you are within a church, it usually means the higher you are as economically.
Okay.
Well,
But compared to
Women have
a private, like an aristocrat as compared to a priest.
But there are many aristocrats who became priests.
So they would be-
Because if you don't want to deal with a family and you just want to be an intellectual, this was a very easy way out. You wouldn't be pressured into getting married because you couldn't, because you were married to God.
You know, in the history of popes in Europe is also a history of prestigious and powerful families.
Yeah. Extremely. It was about position, and if we go into the priests, into the popes, they did have families. You just weren't supposed to know about that.
You know, one other, you know, I mentioned Hildegard von Bingen earlier. You know, women of intellect in her age were often accused of associating with the devil as opposed to a positive force. She actually had to have a priest, a bishop, speak for her to say she wasn't of the devil, so that she wouldn't be accused of being a witch.
Mm-hmm.
But is there no sort of dark side of a woman being an intellectual?
I think that Sor Juana actually had frictions because of that as well, and because she just wasn't a nun who was curious. She was a very vocal nun, right? And that always brings friction because you're a woman. And it's a man's world, right? They kind of don't want you to. So there was some friction with Sor Juana Inés.
The philosophical debates she would have, and people would come speak to her, would it be both genders? Would it be just men?
Oh yeah. I think she mostly debated with men. At the time, men were considered of a higher intellectual stature than women. So this is why she's so important, right? She's debating with the men. She's intellectually being seen as an equal, whereas even as a threat to men's intellect. And so if you were to take like a colonial Mexico lit class, you would definitely be reading her. So that's why I keep saying she's a very important figure. As an intellectual, as a proto-feminist.
I like her.
I really like her, and unfortunately you don't have more nuns within the curriculum because the nun portraits are pretty amazing.